Let's talk about writing monsters of the week. Last century, there was this weird thing called a rerun, and this thing was really important for the monetization of your series. So most series were made to be rerun compatible, which means that they could be watched in any order. So the series never really changed. The world was always the same, the characters were always the same, and each episode was its own little self-contained adventure. Maybe they'd change from season to season, but within a season you know what you're going to get. Examples of this are everywhere. For example, Transformers, Sailor Moon, Power Rangers, Xena, Warrior Princess, X-Files. You can just sit here and name more and more and more series that have an episodic monster of the week approach. There's almost an infinite number of them. But that became a lot less common because the idea of a rerun became very silly. Nobody watches reruns anymore. There's no reason to. We have all of the episodes. We can watch them in any order we want. Why would we just chime in for a random one? These days, most series prefer to have arcs. If we can watch the episodes in order, then we're not going to feel lost, so we can just have the episodes actually accomplish things. And because of that, Monster of the Week writing has become something that is generally looked down on. It's thought of as weak writing or bad writing. But that's not really true, is it? It's just writing that's no longer appropriate. Now that your universe can change from episode to episode, you no longer need a Monster of the Week. It's just not the right tool. So let's say that you're making a game, and you have an open world game, and you're building this open world where there is a demon lord returning after centuries of whatever demon lords do, and they're not returning. And that happens eventually, but first the player gets to wander around the world and have these little adventures in whatever order they happen to find them in. These adventures don't really change the universe at all. They're just there to be fun little self-contained adventures set on an unchanging backdrop. That sounds an awful lot like a Monster of the Week approach to me. In fact, that sounds exactly like it. It sounds like a Monster of the Acre approach. It's a Monster of the Week setup, but paint rolled onto a map. Similarly, if you're releasing your game in chapters, you may find that you want, this fourth chapter to contain the super dragon villain or whatever, but you don't want to spoil that early by bringing them out to be the main villain in earlier chapters. So in earlier chapters, you need other villains, you need other monsters to pick up the slack. Well, understanding how to write Monster of the Week episodes will help you, even if your episodes do involve the world slowly changing. You still need to understand how to write self-contained Monster of the Week episodes, because each of these chapters is a self-contained episode. So let's talk about some of the techniques that might help you if you're writing something like this. Obviously, this involves writing something where the players face some kind of threat over and over and over. And you pretend that the threat is new each week, but it's very clear to everybody that it's not. The example of this would probably be Power Rangers. I can't think of any series that was more Monster of the Weeky than Power Rangers, but sure, in Power Rangers, every week a new guy in a rubber suit would show up to destroy the town, and the Power Rangers would fight him off with their grit and gumption and roller skates. Everybody knows that this monster is not a real threat because everybody knows at the end of the episode everything's going to be the same as it was at the beginning of the episode. So how do you write this stuff? Normally, it's aimed at children, right? I wouldn't say so. I would say that this is not about how young or old the audience is. I would say that it's about the fundamental structure of the story you're trying to tell. Beowulf is essentially a Monster of the Week story. So how do you write one of these in a way that works? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that nobody is ever going to care about the Monster of the Week. It takes effort to make the villain something that people care about. And I mean on-screen effort. You have to spend screen time on that villain, making them into something the players care about. And you don't want to spend all episode building up this monster of the week and then just have them defeated, and congratulations, you have now wasted all of that screen time because it's never going to matter again. That's not a very good approach. Instead, you need to accept that your monster of the week will never be interesting. People will not care about your monster of the week at an emotional level. You still want them to be cool. You still want them to have a cool fight sequence, some cool dynamics, look neat. But you have to understand that this monster will never be something the players feel strongly about. They're never going to go, it's time to go defeat that guy over there that was introduced an hour ago. That's just not going to happen. Instead, the monster is a tool. It's a tool to create whatever plot you're trying to create. In a children's show, this is usually extremely obvious. For example, if Sailor Moon and friends are getting a little bit too obsessed with makeup, here comes the lipstick demon. Oh, is someone getting too obsessed with their karate class and forgetting that they have friends? Well, here comes the karate class friendless demon. The demon is a tool to make sure the story you're trying to tell gets told. This does not have to be a childish morality tale. The examples are because it's easy to have that sort of thing, but this is just a way to make your story happen, so it can be literally anything. You can have it be like, oh, this episode opens with the monster of the week having stomped down several houses, and there are people who are dead and dying, and houses are gone, and people are crying, and the whole episode is the players trying to cope with that, and understanding that this might just be a monster of the week to them, but to these people, it's really life and death. It's important. You can have monsters of the week that support tales of things like infidelity. I don't really care. The point is, you don't have to aim for childish morality plays, but you do have to understand that the monster of the week is a tool to help you tell your story. It is not the story. Now let's go to the other side. Nearly every monster of the week show has some kind of overlord monster that kind of shows up from time to time, but you never actually fight them, and their main role is to send the monsters of the week after you. In Power Rangers, that would be Rita Repulsa. Here's an extremely accurate depiction of Rita Repulsa. This is very common, and there's a reason. All of the emotional power that you were going to have to use to build up this giant cardboard monster that's trying to fight the city can instead just go into Rita Repulsa. So Rita Repulsa is the one responsible for this monster. She's the one who rants about it. She's the one who talks about it. She's the one who gets angry when it fails. So instead of building up this monster emotionally, you're building up Rita Repulsa emotionally. You're trickle charging her. Every episode that passes, you build her up as a villain just a little bit more. Now you can only defeat a villain once before that charge is spent. So that's why you don't defeat her until the end of the season. And then you bring in a new villain, and maybe Rita Repulsa becomes that new villain's lackey, and then you build up Rita Repulsa again, and in 3 seasons she comes back as the lackey, as the main overlord again. And you can do all sorts of stuff, but the point here is that you're doing it with a trickle charge. The point of these episodes is not to make Rita Repulsa cool or dangerous or anything like that. It's just to build her up a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, because you have all the time in the world to finish building her up. This is a very powerful way to make sure that you're utilizing the fact that there are a bunch of monsters of the week. Every monster of the week episode, regardless of the order you watch them in, will help to build up the final fight, the final episode or two of the season. That's one of the main things that you're doing with the monster of the week. So I think it's important to understand that if you have some kind of villain that is a recurring threat, you're using these episodes to build them up, and you have to remember that each villain can only be defeated once before all of that charge is spent. Now, obviously, there are repeating villains that are not anchor villains like this. Like, Bulk and Skull are repeating villains, but they're obviously not anchor villains. They're not villains that drive the plot forward. They're just goofballs. And yeah, they exist to make the plot move, and people care about them to some extent, but they're basically jokes. Got the same with Team Rocket and stuff like that. Those aren't the kinds of villains we're talking about. We're talking about the overlord villains, the anchor villains that drive the whole sequence. Rita Repulsa is a great anchor villain. Most of the Power Ranger villains are great anchor villains, and the reason they're so great is because they're fun. When we show up to, watch this Power Rangers episode, we know what's going to happen. So when Rita Repulsa gets on screen and goes, rah-da-da, and has her big scenery chewing moment, we're really into that. We just really love watching her perform. It's part of the joy of Power Rangers. So your villain, your anchor villain that we're going to have to look at for all season, it has to be someone that we want to look at for all season. If it's someone that just isn't worth looking at, then that season will be wasted because all of the energy that you're pumping into this character is being pumped into a nobody that nobody cares about. This is, to give you an example, in early Final Fantasy XIV, the main anchor villains are these dudes in cloaks. They all look literally 100% the same. They all talk like accountants, and it turns out that they are accountants. Like, literally, they are accountants. They were in charge of a project 20,000 years ago, and then they decided that they were going to be immortal after that. And so they're still just running around being accountants. And they are the most boring, conceivable anchor villains because they are even more monotonous than I am. They literally just talk like this all the time about how things are going, and like, oh, you defeated me exactly as planned. Mwahaha. That's not a very good anchor villain. You need a scenery chewer. Now, if you're playing Final Fantasy XIV and you want an example of a scenery chewer, I would recommend going through Lord Vothri's campaign again, because Lord Vothri is by far the best villain in the first 2/3 of Final Fantasy XIV, because he chews the scenery. Oh, it's great. You love watching Lord Vothri send out his minions and all that stuff because you know that you're going to get a scene of him acting. And just like Rita Repulsa, that is the highlight of these Monster of the Week episodes. We know that we're not really in any danger. We know things are going to just be normal again afterwards. But we get to see Lord Vothri pound his fists on the ground and scream, and that is always the highlight. This sort of setup is very robust. It can be used in all sorts of different video games. It can be used for situations where the background universe can't change, like in an open world game. Or it could be just in a series of events where you need to build someone up over a long period of time, and you're kind of not too particular about how you do it, like a tabletop game. You have Session 1 and Session 2 and Session 3, and each one of them has its own little Monster of the Week to facilitate the story you're trying to tell. And then in Session 4, you have the big boss that you've been building up all the time. There he is. The evil boss that you've been building up for the past 4 episodes. These same sort of considerations apply. So I think it's worth learning a little bit about how to approach that and how to think about it. And I hope that this was helpful. It's already been 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. If you have specific advice that you want to give on this matter, feel free to drop it down below.